Welcome, everyone, to another episode of 100 Words or Less, the podcast. I'm your host, Ray Harkins, and thank you for joining us, me, the guest, the podcast, etc., etc. So I'm on vacation right now, and it's awesome. I'm in San Diego, hanging out with my wife, a little away time from the kiddo, and it's been 9 years since we have been married, and that is it's an accomplishment. 10 years is a bigger deal, but yeah, 9 years, pretty awesome. So shout out to my wife for putting up with me and doing all this weird stuff that she's like, oh man, here's some more time you got to spend away from the family. But anyways, let's talk about guests, because that's why you came here, right? Hrishikesh Hirway. He is a member / founding dude of a band called the 1AM Radio. And more recently, he is doing an amazing podcast that you should be checking out called Song Exploder. Basically, what he does is take apart songs from guitars, samples, whatever it is that this song contains. He breaks it apart, asks the song creator like how this was created. And for those of you that are into the more aggressive stuff, he did a episode on Converge and a song called Dark Horse. It is a beautiful place to start, and then, you'll fall in love with the podcast. It's awesome. So I sat down with him in his LA home, and we talked, but more on him in a minute. Let's get some business out of the way. So some of you picked up the rallying cry from the last episode and tried to start a Wikipedia page. I really, really appreciate that. I'll be corresponding with you and sending out fun stuff to you. But for some reason, it got blocked. I've literally never contributed anything to Wikipedia. So I don't know what the rules and regulations are, but we'll get through this. But you, the listener, I would love your help in starting a Wikipedia page. That legitimizes the show in ways that, other people may just like trip across it and be like, oh yeah. And I think it would be great also to have kind of the jumping off points. Because, at this point, it's like, this is what, episode 120? That's a lot of episodes to dig through. So some people need a little guidance. So, for those of you that are contributing to the Wikipedia page, do that. Be like, hey, here's my favorite episode, and contribute that and write about it and that sort of stuff. Anyways, just an idea. But I want to get some review mentions and another donation plug out there. A person named Meat and Cheese from Great Britain said, I can't believe I found this show so far into it, and I'm so excited about it, which is awesome because that's what I love about this. You can get into it at any time and then dive backwards into the archive and be like, holy crap, this is a bunch of awesome stuff. So thank you for that review on the iTunes store. And there's something really special, at least it was really special to me. So a few episodes ago, I interviewed John Bradley from the band Dads, and that show got so much feedback. People really, really appreciated it and loved our discussion. And so then a few days after I posted the show, I saw a nice donation come through the pipes, and I was like, that name sounds familiar. It was from a person named Kathy Bradley. So I was like, wait a minute, is this John's mother? Because the address was from a town he was originally from. And so anyways, I texted John, and he was like, yep, that is 100% my mom. How amazing is that? So she decided to donate to the show, and I can't thank her enough for that. She was just like, hey, great interview with John. She didn't even say like my son or anything like that. So big shout out to her. It's awesome to get that sort of feedback. I mean, from a person who probably has never listened to a podcast before. So it's amazing. Anyways, propertyofzach.com. Visit them, our awesome media partner. And review the show. Visit the website, 100wordspodcast.com. And then email the show, 100wordspodcast@gmail.com. So for those of you that are regular followers of the show, about once a month I bring on a great friend of the show. His name is Dave Anthony, and he writes for a website called the avclub.com, one of my favorite pop culture destinations. So we talk about records because a lot of you enjoy the recommendation stuff. And if you do, check out a few episodes ago. I posted a bonus show of all recommendations of stuff you should be checking out over the summer of 2014. Anyways, without further ado, here is my discussion with Dave, and then I'll pop back in, give you a little more context for Hrishikesh, and then we'll dive into the interview. Okay? Yeah, I'm gonna say I was disappointed that you decided not to really challenge my my taste and deliver a really hard record for me to get into, because we'll just dive right in. The Hard Girls record that you sent over, was so good. And I know you kind of set me up as saying this could potentially be one of your favorite records of the year, but yeah, tell me more about it, because I never heard of these dudes prior to you showing them to me.
Well, that's the thing, is I felt kind of like I was thinking about it more and more. I was like, I know I said in the last one, like, oh, I should try to find something Ray won't like.
Right.
And it just became, you and I exchanged a few emails trying to, like, figure it out or like narrow it down to like what's something that, like, and not in like a troll way of me being like, oh, like, you're gonna hate this, but like something I would genuinely like and you might not. But it felt like that was just too disingenuous to try and orchestrate. Like, we were kind of like having a lot of similar opinions and nothing was really
That's true.
coming up. And then like this Hard Girls record came out and I was just like, I just need to talk about this to anyone who will listen to me, because the Hard Girls are a band who've been around for a few years now, and they put out a like debut, like 7-song EP, mini LP, whatever you want to call it. And the recording quality is kind of rough, but there's a couple songs on there that are really, really good and got me really interested in them. And the way I came to them was they were on Quote Unquote Records, which is Jeff Rosenstock from Bomb the Music Industry's label. And I was like, oh, this band's pretty cool. But what I didn't know when I first started listening to them, I was like, something about this sounds really familiar, is that their guitar player, Mike, was in one of my favorite bands ever called Shinobu, who are like this really underrated like California Asian man band who like really walk the line between pop punk and indie rock. And I just think we're a really unique band, and the people who got into them all love them, but just not a lot of people got into them. So I started getting into Hard Girls. They put out a record called Isn't It Worse maybe 2 years ago that I really liked. And then this came out, and from the jump, I was just like, this is brilliant. Like, I don't say that often because it sounds super hyperbolic, but like from the start, even though that first song kind of opens with like the Against Me new wave riff,
Totally.
It like really builds to something different. It's not trying to be that Against Me song. Like, from where it goes after those first 40 seconds, it's a totally different song in my mind. And the thing I really love about the record is I've listened to it constantly. I've seen them live now, and like I keep forgetting just how many good songs are on it. Like usually after the third or fourth song, you're kind of settling in and like what to expect. But every time I go through it now, I feel like I'm constantly being blindsided by it. I was like, oh, I forgot this song was on here, and like, oh, I forgot how good this song was. And that just happens from like song 1 through the end at track 14. And there's something about it. They're just like this really wiry, lean 3-piece punk band who, in the first 3 or 4 songs come out and write these really catchy, really short, fast songs. And then midway through the record, towards the end of the record, it really slows down and spreads out and takes its time. It's very, for lack of a better term, patient. It's not rushing to get places. It'll do a long 2-minute instrumental passage to get to a giant hook you never saw coming. And it's been pretty much in constant rotation since I first got the download of it. And like, I play the record constantly, and everyone I've shown it to, my bandmates, friends, I'm like, you have to listen to this record. And everyone, at least most of the people I value really closely have freaked out about it equally as much. So I just want to like keep sharing that, because it's such a cool feeling to be like, I love this thing, and it seems like a lot of the other people I'm around also really love this thing.
Yeah, no, there's definitely that level of enjoyment that you share with other people when it's like just enough under the radar that you feel comfortable enough in being like, oh, hey, have you listened to this, this new record, as opposed to like, oh, have you listened to the new most popular band that's around right now, their new record? Like,
yeah,
of course, everyone's listened to it, but there's definitely that like, oh, dude, have you heard that? And then, without any, your friends obviously will have no, air of pretension of like, oh no, dude, but I've heard of that band, like that'll drop. But those will be like, oh no, I haven't heard that. And then, yeah, that's exactly everything that you're describing about the the fun and joy of the record is exactly what I got as well, where I was listening to it on a their punknews.org stream, because I was just like, and after like the second listen, I immediately went over to the Asian Man store, bought the LP, and yeah, it's so good. It has all of those elements that make the whole Gainesville sound cool, but then they have this like you said, this sort of, joy / wiry punk thing that kind of is emblematic of California and Northern California in particular. It's just all these cool elements that kind of congeal into a unique punk record, which it's harder and harder to do these days.
It's one of those things where it took me by surprise, and with Asian Man specifically, like I think they have a strong history of always kind of having these pockets of small bands that maybe aren't the biggest ones on the label, but are doing really interesting things. And Shinobu is one of them. And this Hard Girls record, to me, I listen to it, and the thing that sticks with me more than anything is like, wow, this is what punk rock can be when it gets old. It can be excited. It can be very energetic, very poppy, very fast paced, but it can feel nuanced, and it can do kind of strange things even with the guitar riffing. It's not straight power chords for a lot of it, like the song 996 Tears, which is just this like 2-minute blast. It's just this constantly moving, guitar riff, and a lot of, the guitar stuff paired with one of the vocalists, like it reminds me a lot of like Archers of Loaf, who are a band I love, who I don't think get referenced all that much anymore. And they have this weird thing of like, this is a pop punk band, this is an indie rock band, and it doesn't try to apologize or wash one hand with the other. It's just like, this is what we are, this is the band we are, and we're really, really good at what we do. And it's exciting for me to see a band come out. You can kind of see the reference points, but they feel like they have their own identity, regardless of when you're like, oh, that kind of sounds like, a No Idea band, or that sounds like a classic Asian Man band. Like, it always feels like Hard Girls, even when they're referencing something else, to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it is interesting to see the sort of Asian Man Records thing as well, where it's like they're, for all intent and purposes, like Asian Man Records isn't really a label in the sense of, they're not going to get out and like give you tour support, but it's like when they put their stamp of quality on it, there's definitely still that reverence of people that, really, really pay attention to music, where it's like, yo, this is going to be quality. It feels so true to this record where it's like, oh yeah, if this came out on any other label that has, less of a reputation, it might have been kind of, lost in the overall shuffle. It maybe eventually would have kind of poked its head up, but because it's on Asian Man, I think it's only strengthened by that fact,
Oh, for sure. And Asian Man's a label to this day for me where when they sign someone, if I've never heard them, I'm going to listen to it just because Mike Park's such a great dude and has, for so long, really across genres, kind of honed in on stuff that, maybe isn't the coolest thing going at the moment, maybe isn't the trendiest thing going at the moment, but is a really, really good thing going at that moment in time. And I am very glad that, he's still putting stuff out, even if he's still working out of his, parents' garage.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's that level of just like, it's heartening. Like he did, it was so cool because he, this was like maybe a year and a half or so ago. He married a friend of mine, and to see him like being the officiant at a wedding was totally like, that's weird. There's Mike Park.
But, you're like, oh, of course he would also know how to be legally able to marry people. What can't this man do?
Totally. And it's heartening. That's all it is, of just like this. It's so cool that, a person is able to subsist themselves just from a financial standpoint of like, oh yeah, just keep doing your thing, man. Keep putting out awesome records, and keep having the friends that will want to, release their B-sides with you, even though they're in gigantic bands. It's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like we should switch gears now to your record, which is very, very different from what I chose.
Slightly.
What made you pick the Under the Skin soundtrack?
I took your challenge of trying to present, because, I know we were trading emails and you said that you were, kind of circling around the idea of soundtracks and, trying to figure out which ones spoke to you and which ones didn't speak to you. So it was like, I think you're in a place of where I was like maybe, I don't know, year and a half or so ago before I took a real deep dive into soundtracks. And so I chose this one in particular just because it does, like, the musician that is the composer of this, of the Under the Skin soundtrack, is like Micah Levi, which honestly I wasn't familiar with her at all prior to this, besides
I
just by
wasn't
name.
either.
Yeah.
When I was searching it out, like, because I was trying to find it on Rdio, and I was like, "Fuck!" Like, who did this? And I saw it was her, and just searched that in and started playing it. And from the jump, I was, as you said, like, I'm kind of dancing around, like, really giving myself full bore to, like, going into the soundtrack world, because I do like a lot of, like, ambient, slow, quiet, even just purely electronic stuff in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
And this really did hit me right away. The thing that stuck out to me is it reminded me a lot of what I like in, like, a John Carpenter film, where it's setting a mood, but it's really is taking you somewhere. And a lot of this, like, from, like, the second track, I kind of put air quotes around that, like, the second movement, if you will,
Right.
It's really fucking unsettling for a long time.
Oh yeah.
It's tense and just, I mean, for me, it reminded me of listening to, and this is a strange comparison, but it reminds me of listening to really intense, like, drone metal records, where it's kind of unsettling. It kind of, is taking you somewhere that maybe you don't really want to be, but it's executed so well that there's nothing you can do but just go with it.
You haven't seen the movie, correct?
I have not seen the movie, no.
Which is like, and that's why I chose this particular soundtrack as well, because sometimes it's very hard for a soundtrack to obviously, like, live on its own and be musically interesting enough for a person to, parachute in like you did and just be like, oh, okay, like, I'm listening to this as music as opposed to a companion piece to something visual. So all the sentiments you're sharing are, like, so obviously completely directly related to the movie, because, like, the movie's unsettling. Like, I saw the movie, and then I think later on that day I sought out the soundtrack and then bought it on vinyl and was just mesmerized by it in the same way that you were, because it was like, it takes you on a journey in the same way that the movie does, and it does it in a way that it's musically akin to obviously a band and a performance as opposed to, like, a soundscape, even though it still does kind of hit those notes for obvious reasons, like as a soundtrack should. But I mean, it's going to be weird because when I'm doing my year-end list, like, I can't help but think about this for being in, like, my potential top 10, just because it's like, for me, it's perfect work music, because it's obviously not,
oh, absolutely,
it won't tear you away from, like, deep thought and something that you're writing or whatever. Yeah, it was just so cool, and it's awesome. I'm glad that you engaged with it, even though you didn't have any sort of visual reference points. It's just like, yeah, I'm just gonna listen to this, and I kind of know, I know Scarlett Johansson's in it, like.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, I had wanted to see Under the Skin, and I'd heard a lot of good things about it. And working at AV Club, like, we have our film people who I read their reviews and see what they're talking about. And there's a lot of stuff I'm really interested in. It's just often really difficult for me to find the time to go out and go to the movies.
Yeah.
And kind of like you were saying, like, this is good work music, and that's kind of what has always appealed to me about getting into soundtracks. Is it's like a lot of stuff to kind of, all right, this can give me 30 minutes to 80 minutes of sounds that I can just kind of, it keeps my momentum up. And it's why mentally it reminds me of something like Pelican or Isis even, which has vocals, but a band that is writing these really long things that are very subtle in the way they change. It's not bludgeoning you with an idea. It's just going to slowly and surely ratchet up that tension until there were times where it pulled my focus away, because it would work me into this place where I'm like, holy shit, like, I feel really tense and, like, need to, like, not be writing. I need to look at something else and just, like, break from this. And it makes me want to see the movie, which I already did, but it makes me like, all right, I should actually search this out. And this is something that I should be spending time with. And the one point of yours that I'd like to kind of talk about, because I think it's really fascinating, is I feel like we're living in this time where people are appreciating soundtracks as musical work and no longer just as accompaniment. And I find that really fascinating, because listening to something like this is a really amazing work that has been put together, and I think it stands up as strong as anything that's a traditional song or traditional album.
Yeah. Oh, totally. No, it is interesting because there are certain things like in my deep dives into the soundtrack world there, it's like whatever, but like I'm going to reference a terrible release that I was really disappointed in purchasing, like the original Last House on the Left soundtrack, which was,
oh yeah,
I referenced it in an email to you where it was like I bought it and I bought it having seen the movie forever ago, didn't really think about the soundtrack or score to it, and then it was stupid. It was just noises, basically. Like I didn't feel like it did anything, And so
for sure,
and
it's just like the sound of like chains rattling and like glass breaking.
Yeah, it was almost as like sound effecty record. It's like, dude, what? This is so dumb. I can't believe I just spent $20 on this vinyl.
I can't believe anyone put that out. Anyone's like, man, I want to jam to Last House on the Left.
Dude, it's astonishing how much of a cottage industry has been built up around these sort of schlocky, B horror movies / cult classics. It's unbelievable, but it is interesting to listen to these things. Like there are, it's like that poster company Mondo. It's like them releasing. They have released pieces of vinyl that I've purchased. I've never seen the movie. I'm like, well, I'm just going to dive right into this. And it's like there are certain soundtracks that I've listened to have been like, that's really cool. And then go back and watch the movie. And I'm like, wow, I like the movie that much better because of it. And so I honestly wouldn't be surprised if once you see Under the Skin, you're going to be like, you're already going to be anticipating the tension. And then when the music starts, it's going to give you that sort of weird feeling of like, same way as like when you watch a band play and you already are familiar with their music. It's like, it's so weird.
Well, yeah, the way I liken this is like, and it kind of works really well here where with the two records we're discussing is that like, I listened to that Hard Girls record to death, and I went to see them. They were opening for NGX and Jihad. They played like 6 songs, and I'm like, holy shit, like what's next? And like they would hit that first chord, and I would be like, yeah, like it would just all come rushing to me. And I think, listening to the soundtrack first when I do see the movie is going to give me the experience of seeing the band live. It's like I'm familiar with the movements. I kind of have an idea of how this might work, but now I'm in for the visual element that this has been lacking,
Yeah.
And it's not, a perfect analogy, but like that's kind of how I've been thinking about it in my head. Like I'm going to, hear the first note of something that I'm already familiar with and be like, oh God, like something's about to happen. I don't know what, but I know what this is building to.
Yeah.
At least in a feeling manner, maybe not in a story or plot manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's totally cool. And I love the attention that, people continually have with the, curation of soundtracks and like how they are getting, bands involved, like that movie, that Tom Cruise movie Oblivion, how M83, M83, however you like to pronounce it, did the soundtrack for it. It's just cool to see that the usual conventions of just like, hey, we're going to work with these like 10 composers, the whole industry, the whole movie soundtrack industry is going to work with these 10 people and that's it. And it's, the same way that, Trent Reznor has done so many cool things for his scores, but yeah, it's just so cool to see that landscape change and engage people in ways that they probably never would have, 10 years ago.
Well, and that's the thing is like, you kind of, like, I know it's something you've been interested in, like with, talking to you about it and like doing this, like you're kind of opening that door for me to be like, all right, like this is something, I've kind of flirted with the idea of like, all right, I should, buy some soundtracks, kind of see what this is all about. But after really spending time with this, I really do want to give it more of a deep dive. And again, like, I don't think I'll ever be an expert on it, but I do really enjoy it. And for me, that's all I need is like, if I like something, I'm going to do it. And if I don't, well, I tried.
The feeling that I got once I started to open up this world is definitely the same fashion as like, when you first dive into, punk or hardcore or whatever, you just start to feel more connected to this weird scene that exists, but is mostly ignored. And so when you start to be like, oh, I see, this guy was important for these years and vice versa. It's just, you feel at this juncture in my life, in my early 30s, to be like, hey, I can dive into this other musical subculture that is awesome. And it makes me feel not the same way of getting into that stuff, but just another, area of obsession.
Yeah, exactly. And there's one thing I totally forgot to mention about the Hard Girls record. I don't want to waste too much more time of the listener and you. But one of the most important things that I didn't note until I like looked over at my shelf and saw the record sticking out is that Hard Girls is actually the backing band for Classics of Love, which is Jesse Michaels from Operation Ivy's hardcore band.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
So yeah, the Classics of Love record that Asian Man put out a couple years ago, which is phenomenal. If you haven't checked it out, if you really love like 80s ska punk hardcore, it's amazing at that. But the band with Jesse singing is Classics of Love. Without Jesse singing and the bass player and guitar player singing, they're Hard Girls. So like they've got a really good range that like is kind of often lost because people are just like, oh, it's the dude from Operation Ivy, and don't really pay attention to the other dudes surrounding that. And that's just something that like I would feel absolutely remiss if I didn't like stop everything and derail our conversation to bring up.
No, that's those little contextual notes make everything that much better. So thank you for doing so.
Welcome.
Well, I think this was very informative to me, you, and everybody else that's listening. So thank you again, Dave, for your expertise and continually impressing me with your recommendations.
Likewise, Ray. Always a pleasure, and I hope people check both these things out and dig it.
Yeah, for sure. So there you go. There's the records that you need to check out. Thank you very much, Dave, for contributing, as always. And so, yeah, Hrishikesh. He, like I said, is an amazing hosts an amazing podcast, is an amazing musician, does a lot of film score stuff. He's just a good dude. We had traveled in a lot of the same circles, but never met one another. So he was very gracious and said that I would love to be on your podcast. That would be awesome. So I went up to his house. We hung out for a bit. We discussed so many different things, and it was a great discussion. And I just love it because even though he has gone different ways in regards to the music world and not getting more aggressive, but getting more, obviously soundtracky, if that's a word. But he still has so many of the same upbringings as many of us have had. So check this out, and after the show, I will talk to you again.
I made my way there, breathed that air and walked on those dunes. Sank my feet in the sand, holding your daughter's hand.
No, the flight of that, yeah. I usually start these things off just my own personal sort of introduction to you and what you were doing or what you are doing. I became aware of you just obviously through 1AM radio and because of my affiliation with Level Plan, like we were talking about earlier. And it was always one of those things where I knew you had existed in the sort of, hardcore punk world prior to like 1AM. Like that was where your roots are. Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I used to go to like straight edge shows in Massachusetts.
Right. And so then obviously once 1AM radio was a thing, and obviously on Level Plane, I love that notion of just like, oh hey, yeah, like all that stuff that you listen to, like how about you try to listen to this? I presume that was like an appealing thing for you when you started working with Level Plane, or like was that even a notion, or you're just like, oh, this is a fun opportunity?
I never thought of it as like a conscious attempt to try and change people's mind or anything. It's just
right.
that I liked the bands on Level Plane. I liked the label. I liked Greg,
right.
And he liked what I was doing, and so it seemed like a good opportunity.
Yeah.
More than anything, just to be like, I was just thinking, here's somebody who wants to put out the record, and
right.
I love what he does, and ready to do like awesome colored vinyl that I want to do. So
yeah,
it seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, you're like, this door is open. Pretty much should walk through this because this seems like it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
The notion of people, because I mean, how old are you? Are you 30? Like
in my 30s.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, I'm 33, and so it's like I feel like I've been afforded a certain luxury in the fact that it's like, yeah, when you're whatever 14, 15, 16 years old, get into punk and hardcore, and then through either one or two circumstances, your musical palette starts to widen, and you're able to appreciate more stuff. But then I find so many people that don't have that aren't afforded that luxury of widening their palettes. It's like I get bummed because I look at that and I'm like, oh man, you're not experiencing, like you were going to view yourself as this thing that you were when you were 15 years old and like never give anything any other time of day. I'm sure you experienced that.
I never actually, like, I know that those people exist.
Sure.
And I'm sure we're at a lot of the shows that I play and be like, whatever about this. But
right.
The people that I hung out with always had, really diverse music tastes. For me, like 1994 was about Fugazi as much as it was about like DJ Shadow and Portishead. And I feel like a lot of the people that I used to play music with sort of were similar. You know, I remember like the first sort of bigger hardcore shows I would do, they were all with Drums Dream, and those guys, for being a heavy, you know, screamy band, all those guys ever talked about was like, you know, Bowery Electric and a lot of pretty melodic stuff, and so that's why I think they were excited to take me on tour, because they were like, oh, this is like a lot. This is like the other side of the stuff that we listen to.
Right. This is, yeah, because there's definitely that, especially as a touring band, there's that notion of like, oh, this is nice to not play with a typical band that sounds exactly like us.
Yeah.
This may alienate some of the audience. They may want to, you know, sit down or fall asleep or what, you know, whatever cliche you can put on your music. But as a band, it's refreshing to be like, oh yeah.
Yeah. Like I used to get mixtapes from Jeff Smith, the singer.
Oh yeah.
And like there wouldn't be any hardcore on it. It would all be like sort of dreamy electronic, indie pop stuff.
Do you think that has? Because I mean, I totally that experience definitely, you know, rings true with myself and my friends. I think some of it. I mean, I've tried to theorize on like why that is. Where it's like a lot of the music, especially like that people end up making careers off of. There's always that aspirational aspect of like, I wish I could be doing this. Like in the sense of like, you know, whatever, like a pop punk band, like, you know, Newfound Glory or whatever. It's like, you know, that those individual members have all these different tastes, and they're just like, I wish I could do this. And of course there's some side projects or whatever. But do you think like, because we're young, we're limited to the experiences, like what we can actually like play, you know?
I don't know. I guess what I've made, the One Am Radio is just a product of what I can do.
Right. Yeah. You're like, this is the limit of my scope. From a musical, like my musical talents. I mean, not saying that your musical talents are limited, but that this is what's, I guess, at grasp for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this idea that, you know, you have to edit yourself. There's, even if you love 18 different ideas,
right,
you only have enough time in a day. Time is really the biggest factor.
That's true.
You know, and if you want to push anything forward, you could either push that one idea forward every day for a year, or you could push 365 different ideas, you know, a tiny bit ahead each day.
Right.
And so I think it makes sense that once you start something and it's, you know, you've got any kind of momentum, you're like, well, I don't want to give that up and
right,
do something completely different.
Yeah. If something, the proverbial ball is rolling, it definitely, especially from just a, you know, life satisfaction standpoint, it's like, oh, I got to divert this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you yourself, you were born and raised in the East Coast, like you were saying.
Yeah, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Where in particular?
Peabody, Mass.
Of course, you said it right.
Yeah.
Peabody. You can't say Peabody.
No.
And so what was your, you know, how was your growing up in that area? Because I've never been to Peabody, but I've been, I mean, like, because Worcester, that's not too far from it. Is there?
No, it's like 40 minutes to the south.
Okay. I spent time there for like shows and played shows in Boston and stuff like that, but never been there. So what?
There's no reason to go unless you needed to go to the mall.
Okay. You guys have a good mall?
We have the good mall, yeah. We used to have the bad mall, and then, you know, things switched around and our mall became the good mall.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Which is huge. Like malls are such such a focal point for teenage life and just, I mean, tour life too, because you were just like, what are we going to do? I guess we'll go to a mall.
Yeah.
So what was your family structure like? You have brothers and sisters, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I have one older sister.
Okay.
And it's just me, my mom and dad, and my sister.
Okay. And what did your parents do?
My mom worked at Sears.
Okay.
And my dad's a food scientist.
Oh, wow. That must have been an interesting topic of conversation. Or if he even brought it home.
You know, I never learned to talk about it with my dad until much later.
Right.
I think also my dad's work when I was growing up wasn't nearly as interesting as it is now. Now he actually like develops new products and comes up with new things.
Okay.
So we talk about it a lot more. Back then he was doing more like compliance with the FDA.
Oh, sure.
You know, stuff like that. Not as exciting.
Right. And what's your background, like your nationality?
Oh yeah, my family's Indian.
Okay.
My mom and my dad came over in the 70s. My sister was born in India, and I was born in Boston.
Oh, okay. And their desire to come over here to the States was, I mean, opportunities? Like, was there any?
Yeah, my dad came over for grad school.
Oh, okay.
So he was living here. He met my mom in India, they had an arranged marriage, and then when they got married, she moved to America as part of the deal.
Okay, yeah. And they, because the cultural difference of the arranged marriage and stuff like that, was that something that was ever, I guess, ordained for you? Like that was what they.
No, I mean, I think by the time I was old enough for it to even be a thing, it was, this is one of the things that's luckily about having an older sibling, that we were already sort of culturally American enough that it wasn't even ever.
It wasn't going to be imposed on you.
No.
Right. Yeah, because it especially from the concept of like, because some families obviously it's like once they do relocate to America and like start to incorporate some of the Western values or whatever, but then they're like, oh, we have to hold on to these one or two things in order to make us feel like we're connected.
Right. No, they're pretty progressive.
That's good.
Yeah.
And so then, as you started to kind of grow up in your formative years, what kind of kid did you find yourself being? Like, were you? Because you strike me, even though we've obviously just met, but in observing your musical output, it's like you seem like a very thoughtful, quiet, reserved, friendly. But and I don't mean this in a mean way, but like at a distance where it's like it'll take you a minute in order to like warm up to a person and be like, okay. So I don't know if any of those things ring true to your your growing up or anything like that.
I was growing up. I think I thought I was like a math science kid.
Oh, okay.
Although I did a lot of art. I played music and I drew all the time.
Okay.
I think there was just a thing back then where if you were smart or if you were good at school, then people kind of tended to assume you were going to, be more math oriented.
Sure.
Like the idea of being good at language or something is not something that really manifests when you're in 5th grade, I feel like.
Yeah, no.
But I was basically a nerdy kid. I played Dungeons and Dragons and
perfect.
Hung out with my friends and
you were an indoor kid, as they say.
Yeah. I played basketball and I played soccer.
Oh, okay.
I loved that, but I wasn't like a jock.
Right. You weren't.
Yeah.
But
I wasn't like a shut-in or anything, but I did have I watched a lot of TV and I had really nerdy tastes.
Right, nerdy interests. You were,
I read fantasy novels and.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
What's dungeon? How deep did you get into Dungeons and Dragons?
Pretty deep.
Okay.
My best friend Matt, growing up, he had all the books. He had a lot of relatives who didn't have children, so he would sort of be the recipient of lots and lots of gifts every year.
Yeah.
So we would hang out, and I would get the benefit of all his stuff, so I could like read his comic book collection and read his Dungeons and Dragons books, and so we would always do that stuff together. We would, I actually learned D&D, without Matt, and then Matt and I got into like advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh yeah.
We had all the books, and we had, pretty deep. It was like a pretty big collection of.
Yeah, you were leveling up.
Yeah. The funny thing is, like, we didn't have like a ton of people to play with.
Sure.
We had maybe, in middle school, we finally met a couple guys who we were playing sometimes with, but a lot of the times it was just the two of us, and you can't really do that much.
No. Yeah, you're limited.
Yeah, so it wasn't like we had like a weekly crew
that
we would get together. It was a lot of it was just reading the books and sort of imagining.
Sure.
Stuff.
This is what a quest would be like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Making characters.
Yeah.
And then just sort of dreaming about the world.
And that I love people that have that sort of like singular experience, because I didn't do Dungeons and Dragons, but I did this Lone Wolf. It was this book series. There was 12 or 13 books. It's basically a way more in-depth version of like Choose Your Own Adventure.
Yeah.
I still have those books on my bookshelf because they were so formative for me to, like you said, create these worlds that was like, yeah, of course there's a structure and there are things like the process I loved, but then just giving me, because I'm an only child, and like the ability to just be like, dude, I'm going to be in here for like 4 hours. And just that ability kind of like to feel that level of like independence.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of it, even if you're playing sports or you're doing these other like, typical kind of, whatever elementary school / junior high experiences, there's still that element of like, well, I'm doing this because I got told to or whatever, you're not consciously thinking about it, but
yeah,
that's great. I get excited anytime anybody has that experience.
But yeah, I went pretty deep.
That's good. I'm glad.
And it wasn't just Dungeons and Dragons, we were into like Palladium. And,
okay. Robotech?
We did have, we we never played Robotech, but there was a Robotech, book that went in that Palladium world.
Yeah.
There was a Marvel role-playing game.
Oh yeah.
That
Definitely. Yeah, it's so great. And it's so interesting now, obviously. It's like how the, nerd culture is. I mean, it's not even, that's not it.
Yeah, it's just pop culture.
Exactly. And so it's like the notion of that ever being like, in a corner being like, oh, like that's, you got to go to a weird shop to get that stuff. Right. Now it's just like, it's so quaint. You're like, oh yeah, go into a mall.
Yeah.
And then so when did music start to kind of infiltrate your life? Or like, were your parents musical? Did they?
My parents weren't musical, but I think it was their idea to start me on piano lessons when I was 6 or 7.
Okay.
I think it was their idea, and I said I wanted to do it. I mean, who knows what?
I know I was going to say it,
but I said I wanted to do it.
Right.
And but we didn't have a piano or anything like that. Actually, my sister was really sweet. She was 11 at the time. Mm-hmm. She drew like a keyboard on a piece of paper for me, and so I would like practice on that. I would just I would put my fingers on the keys on the piece of paper and play on the kitchen table.
Right. So if she's really committed, she would make the noises for you too. Yeah. No, that's very sweet though. She's like, well, I'm gonna take care of my brother. I'm gonna hook him up. This is what we're gonna do. Yeah, because I mean, it's always, the piano is always such an interesting thing, like especially when it comes into a person's life, like willingly, because then there's that pushback of like, because I started playing when I was in like 4th or 5th grade and did it for about 2 years, but all I cared about was like, hey, I really want to learn Tom Petty Freefall. I want to learn the Cheers theme song.
Right.
I wasn't learning anything. I was just learning to mimic.
Yeah.
But I'm sure your experience was obviously different in the sense. I mean, maybe you were bringing songs in, but there was maybe more of a music theory or like how to actually like read notes or yeah. how you're actually supposed to learn it. Maybe I just had bad teacher. And so the piano started off, and was it always one of those things where it was, prevailing throughout your life? Like you still continued lessons for years and years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I played, I had like a teacher, and I would go have lessons, and we would have a recital, every year.
Yeah.
And then in middle school, there was like a school band.
Okay.
And I started playing in that, but then, but I was put in the percussion section, piano was in the percussion section, so it was me and like 9 drummers, and I think there was another kid who would play keyboards, and there was only one keyboard there, playing the piano part, so there would be times when I would just be put, go play the bass drum, and there'd be like 8 or 9 guys playing snare,
right?
But when I started playing drums, because we'd be hanging out after rehearsal or whatever, we'd have section rehearsal and it would be just us, and then we would all goof off and then take turns. There's only one drum kit, so one person would get to play the drum kit, and everybody else had like a bass drum and a snare drum and like the keyboard and like glockenspiel,
right? And
so that was how I first started playing drum set, was just fooling around there,
just messing around in the music department, and
then that was it. Then I was like,
okay,
that's what I want to do.
I was going to say, it was like this, so, because obviously it's like the notion of guitar, drums, like that is way more sexy, even though you don't know that term at that time. So did piano basically start to take up like 5% of your musical interest? Yeah,
I mean, I was still like I was still a piano player primarily, and then in high school I could switch to like jazz piano.
Okay.
There were like jazz piano lessons I could take, and so I started doing that. But there was also at my high school there was like a room with a drum set in it, and my jazz piano player and the jazz piano teacher and the drum teacher played in a band, so they were friends.
Okay.
So I asked him if he would ask the drum teacher if I could get a key, if I could like practice, when nobody else was using it. He said, yeah. I would just go in there with headphones.
What records in particular were you trying to play?
Fugazi 13 Songs was the main.
Okay.
That was the one. At
least you're choosing a really technical, like, that's not an easy, it'd be one thing if you're like, Green Day Dookie. Like,
right. No, it was just that. I mean, I didn't own a lot of music.
Okay.
And that was one of the tapes I had.
Yeah.
And I had a Walkman, and that was the one. I loved the drums on that record.
Yeah.
The drums that I loved were on Meanwhile, the Helmet record.
Oh, of course.
But I and there were a couple songs that I could try and play, but there was a ton of fills.
Oh my gosh,
crazy fills on that record, so I couldn't really do it.
Right.
And I couldn't really do 13 songs either, but
you felt like you had more of a grasp.
But I was like, okay, I understood the song structure, and I was just trying to play along.
Right.
Yeah.
How did kind of like independent music? I mean, because like landing on Fugazi, like at that age, like because you were in high school at the time.
Yeah.
You were saying, that's that's obviously. Both Helmet and Fugazi are I would define as somewhat mature. Like, I remember when I was 14, 15 years old, and it was like, yeah, I listened to Fugazi, but it wasn't like it wasn't revelatory for me at the time.
Yeah.
Like, I was just like, oh, I get it, it's cool, but it's like Minor Threats are way cooler.
Yeah.
So how did independent music start to infiltrate your life? Was it just through friends?
Yeah, it was through friends. I mean, my friend Matt.
Okay.
And I, there was a time when we started. We're going to Newbury Comics.
Oh, yeah.
Stopped being about the comics.
Okay.
And started being about
look at this other
music.
stuff. Right. Look at this other stuff over here.
Yeah. And so we got in, started getting into, in like 7th grade, started getting into, I don't know what it was. It was just that idea of finding music that was transgressive in a way, or just different from what everybody else was listening to, and just I don't know, felt a little bit dangerous or exciting.
Right.
NWA,
Yep.
Public Enemy, Ice-T, and then Metallica, Megadeth.
Sure.
And like Faith No More.
Oh yeah.
I guess that was right around when Nevermind came out.
Sure.
And so that kind of supplanted everything else that I had listened to. Everything else had been like whatever top 40
right
stuff before then, just whatever is
whatever was existing in the ether. Right.
Yeah. My first tape was a White Snake tape that my sister let me get off of her like
Columbia house.
She was like, I get 8 tapes, you can have one, what do you want to get?
Totally.
Okay.
And this is a deal. They're a penny.
Yeah.
You're like, oh wait, but the second shipment is like $9 million.
Yeah. But so I really liked Here I Go Again, so I chose White Snake.
That's
that was
perfect.
My first thing.
Yeah, that's the first record you got. That's perfect. Very monumental. I love the notion of the when you were looking for like you didn't know what you were looking for musically, but it's like the idea of album art being such an important part of music of that era, where it was like, you looked at, it's like I remember going into like a warehouse and being like looking at a Cannibal Corpse record and being like, that I can't get that. Like, that is terrifying.
Right.
And I never did, because I always knew, I'm just like, that is way too much for me.
Yeah.
But like looking at those other records, like Megadeth, same thing. I mean, and whatever, Dr. Dre's Chronic and like Snoop Dogg, like all that stuff, you look at the record cover and you're like, that is a world. I don't even know how to describe that, but it's like, and then obviously it's like, because you have no way of sampling it, you're just like, I hope this is good.
Yeah.
That leap of faith where it's like, and I'm spending $17 on this thing, like I'm only gonna have one tape a month or whatever.
Yeah. Those days, I mean, all my music was just cassette dubs of other people's stuff.
Sure.
But so I don't know exactly where that went from, how that led to Fugazi. I can't remember. I remember, I remember the summer of like 9th grade was me and Matt. He had a Sega Genesis, and I used to go over there and we would play Sonic the Hedgehog.
Of course.
And we used to listen to this tape over and over again. On one side was Ned's Atomic Dustbin, and the other side was Fugazi, and we would just like listen to it over and over again. It had like an auto.
Oh yeah.
It would just flip to the other side automatically.
Perfect soundtrack.
And yeah, somehow that.
Right, and then that opened the doors up. And so then, as you started to did you have the idea that you wanted to like play in a band or anything once you started to do drums? Like, was that something like, okay?
I didn't at first. I think I just loved the instrument, and I loved the physicality of what you have to do with the drums.
Right.
And then I remember in 10th grade, these guys wanted to do like a cover for a school performance, and they asked me if I would play drums with them, and I was like, okay. I wanted to do a Smashing Pumpkins song, so like, all right, somebody in my grade knew that I played drums, and And so
I always love that, where it's like, especially from a drumming perspective, where it's like, oh yeah, I heard that dude that plays drum, like in the corner, or like just that you get pulled out of obscurity, where it's like, yeah, I do.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was the first. I wasn't trying to start a band or anything. I just
Right.
I played with those guys.
Yeah. Was it terrifying getting up there in front of the audience, or were you kind of like, I feel protected back here because of the drums?
I felt real stage fright at different times in my life. I don't think that was one of them.
Right. You probably didn't have the wherewithal to kind of put that together.
Yeah. I think you're right. Being behind the drums made it a little bit, and it was somebody else's song.
That's true.
It was, the pressure was sort of diffuse.
Right.
It wasn't nearly like the first time I sang in front of people. That was much scarier.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, because you're obviously putting a reflection of yourself out there.
Yeah.
And if you get negative feedback, you're like, well, clearly you don't like me.
Yeah.
And so then, what was your actual first band beyond the like, where you guys started to, try to play shows and like put that stuff together?
That wasn't till later.
Okay.
That was a band I had in college.
Okay.
Was when I first started doing like serious shows, like going to other cities and whatever, trying to really
right.
do it.
And you were playing drums in that?
I was playing drums.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it? What band?
I was playing
was
drums and singing.
Okay.
And we had like two singers.
Okay.
As
you
like,
should.
Again, like the Fugazi model.
Right.
So we sort of all took turns writing songs.
Okay.
But and we tried for a little bit switching off, where like I would play guitar. So at that point, I had learned how to play guitar and started to write songs.
Sure. But
I still, consider myself a drummer, and the guitar was just sort of utility.
Sure.
A way to write songs.
Right.
So I would play drums and sing in that.
And what band was that?
That was called Pinstripe.
Okay, I don't think because I knew you played in bands, but I just didn't. Prior to the 1 a.m. radio, I just didn't. I didn't know what you were doing musically.
Yeah.
Had you done anything that was like did you put out records with anybody else that you?
That was the first record that I put out was a Pinstripe record.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was on my friend's label.
Okay.
And that was a label that the first 1 a.m. radio record.
Oh, okay.
Came out on too.
Perfect. And so then as you were kind of, matriculating through high school, what were your sights set on in regards to like, were you like, I need to do music? Was, what was the...
I had no idea that was even something one could do.
Sure. The practicalities of it, right?
Yeah. I didn't really understand. I didn't understand how people, like I listened to Minor Threat and Fugazi and like was really into the idea of that sort of culture,
right?
But I didn't understand it, and I was somewhat on my own about it. Like I didn't have people around me who were like, "Let's start a band."
You didn't have like a scene, right? You didn't have a scene or anything like that you felt, right?
There were kids who were in bands, like Piebald,
sure,
and Converge. These were like the big bands in Massachusetts around that time, but I just didn't quite connect the dots to figure out how that happens or how you do it.
Yeah.
And certainly didn't think about the idea of doing music for a living.
Right.
The biggest change happened in high school though, where I realized that I wasn't, I had this idea of myself as this like math science kid beforehand, but I realized that was actually more imposed on me by my surroundings than by anything else.
Than your passion, sure.
Yeah, and then in high school I had some really great teachers, and I realized that actually wasn't where my heart lay. Okay. And I had an English teacher who I really, really admired, and I had a philosophy teacher who I really admired, and that was what I wanted to do. I was like, okay, I want to be like these guys. I want to teach.
Right.
So my plan was to be an English teacher.
Okay, that was your pivot. Yeah, my wife is an English teacher, and the notion of like once you kind of set down that path, there's like no practical use for an English mate. Like it was like, well, like that's pretty much what you're gonna do. Like you either, there's obviously delineations of that of like, oh, do you want to teach at college or do you want to teach high school, right? Elementary, but beyond, like you're gonna be a teacher.
Yeah.
But that's good that you felt like you went towards that as opposed to like the path that you were on, because it is always difficult to be able to sort through what's been just kind of habitual and then what is actually like, striking your fancy. Like,
I had the rare experience of actually liking high school.
Yeah.
I mean, not for the first year maybe, but
Okay.
but by the end, I really liked it and really appreciated going there. And so the two teachers I was talking about, I just wanted to do what they want. I wanted to go back to that high school and teach there. Yeah.
Sure.
And both of those guys, the English teacher and the philosophy teacher, they had both gone to Yale.
Okay.
For their undergrad and for their master's degrees, and then came back.
Okay.
And so I was like, oh,
You're like, they did that.
That's what I should do.
Sure.
That's what. So then that became my business.
So that was what you did. Because there's obviously, I mean, when you say Yale, there's immediate connotations that come to that, where it's just like, especially, I mean, it's like in what you are doing now, not only like musically and professionally and everything, where it's just like it's easy for a person to write somebody off. It's like, oh yeah, you're one of those people, like you're a Yale person or whatever. Like I see where you're coming from. Have you had to not specifically battle anybody like face to face, but have you noticed any sort of prejudgments that come into, you know, kind of what you're doing and what you're putting out there, where it's like, well, that's typical, or well, that's what's expected?
I don't think so, at least not consciously.
Sure.
And you know, in music stuff, it I feel like with 1AM radio, it didn't usually come up.
That's cool.
It would just be, you know, maybe it would come up in conversation, but for the most part, I don't think people even know that about me.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, which is good, because it's like, especially too, where it's like, I think something that gets fostered so much within the independent like punk and hardcore scene is that like, if you are trying to like be successful at something that isn't music, it's like looked down upon. Like that notion of just like, oh cool, you're going to Yale, sell out. Like, I mean, not like that was actually happening, but there's definitely those ideas of like, no, just chill out. Why don't you just like play in band, man? It's so much cooler or whatever. But that's good you never felt that direct pressure.
I mean, I think by the time I was playing shows and, you know, sort of felt like a part of a scene, I'd already been in college for a couple of years.
Right.
Or a year and a half or so. And so that's how I met people. That was like the context in which I met people. Mm-hmm. The dudes from Jerome's Dream, you know, they lived in New Haven. That's where I lived.
Sure.
And that was just sort of a fundamental fact about me when they met me.
Right.
And so I don't think there was any kind of second guessing of like, oh, should you be doing that or should you not be doing that? That's just what I was doing.
Right. Yeah, it's like they knew you for you as opposed to like a notion of you before they met you or anything like that. It sounded like the Jerome's Dream dudes were kind of the first to like really pull you into that scene, like on a deeper level. In terms of like not just going to shows,
right? You know, I was going to shows in Massachusetts when I'd be there, you know, and when I'd be with my friends there, we would go to just like random DIY straight edge shows. Sure.
Were you ever straight edge yourself, or did you ever identify that? Okay.
Yeah.
Are you still, or you've?
Yeah.
I mean, by definition, yeah, you're not. For the listeners out there, he is not wearing his varsity edge jacket currently. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I stopped. At some point, you know, in my late teens, early 20s, I started to feel like I started to realize the utility of labels and also like the limitations of them.
Totally.
And I got to a point where I was like, oh, I understand why it was important for me to feel like there was a group that I could identify my values with, you know, because what happened was I already was essentially straight edge without knowing the term.
You were default straight edge, right?
As much as like a 14-year-old can be.
Totally.
But I had this idea that like, you know, my grandfather didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't eat meat.
It's not part of the Indian culture is not fostering, you know, heroin addicts and like, it exists obviously there, but it's like, that's not right.
I mean, there's, you know, my dad ate meat. My parents not like aren't drinkers, but like they didn't.
Casual drinking.
Sure. My mom used to talk about my grandfather all the time. She had a lot of respect for him, and he was in jail with Gandhi. He was a judge in India. He was sort of like a little hero.
Right.
I met him a few times. Yeah.
Sure.
Met him a few times growing up, but he always had this sort of looming presence in my life, and I just thought he was a badass.
Right. Yeah.
So I was like,
he doesn't drink. That sounds pretty cool. I'll go ahead and do that.
That's cool. I understand why that appeals to him. I just understand why that's important or something. And
sure.
So whether it was a knee-jerk thing or not, that was my initial instinct. Was like, I want to be like that.
Sure.
And then I started listening to Minor Threat.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody introduced me to Minor Threat, and I was like, oh, these guys actually, there's like a word for this. Yeah. And there's like people who make cool music who believe in the same stuff.
Totally.
I didn't feel like a pressure to have a group to belong to, but having, recognizing that there was one was really cool and empowering.
Mm-hmm.
But then, after a few years, I realized that like I didn't need that association in order to feel empowered.
Totally.
To feel empowered about my decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So, and some of the
there's
artifice of it.
Of course, there's negative connotations. Any label you attach yourself to, there's going to be negative connotations to, and it's like, as an adult, one doesn't necessarily need to label themselves as such. It's like no, you're just But it's like for people that know, it's like you can and so the like you said, the Jerome's Dream guys, like that's when you started to feel kind of like part of a scene where you were regularly existing in the context of this kind of independent community.
That's when I was actually like playing shows,
sure,
as opposed to just going to shows,
right?
And and it also was at the same time that I met those guys, I started having a new group of friends that I met at Yale who were into the same stuff.
Okay.
So my friend who started the record label,
sure,
that Pinstripe's first record was on, and the first few 1AM radio records were on.
Mm-hmm.
He was somebody I met when I was a sophomore. His name's David Slade, and he was like, "I'm going to start
an
independent label," and he also went to Yale.
Okay.
And he and I started playing in a band together with a couple other guys, and then I started basically doing Garbage Czar with David and his best friend Carl.
Okay.
So David grew up in New Haven and had a bunch of friends from New Haven, and went to Yale, and so he kind of straddled the line. And I had met a bunch of guys in New Haven just through music before, so there was a small circle of people who kind of had a foot in both worlds,
right?
And musicians who like there were New Haven musicians and there were Yale musicians, and then there were people who sort of
mixed in both, sure.
Yeah, and that was sort of where I hung out.
Okay, got it.
And it was in that context that I met, playing shows with those guys. That's when I met Jerome's Dream. We
sure.
played like a house show together.
Yeah.
The band that I was in with David and Carl, the Garbage Czar guys, which was like a emo band for lack of a better term.
Sure.
We played a house show with Jerome's Dream.
Okay.
And that was how, and we became friends.
Got it. I always find it so like, I love how obviously diverse, independent music is, and the kind of, that whole, I mean, even though the DIY notion is obviously, there's a television network named DIY Network. It's like, it's not delegated specifically to what we know. But you see threads in what, I mean, everything that you're doing now currently from the podcast, to obviously 1AM radio, it's like everything has these undercurrents of people like myself who are specifically looking for it, I find it. Yeah. But it's like, even if you're not looking for it, you can probably still see elements of it. It's like, you having, Converge on the show is just one of those things where it's like, 94% of the people that are listening to the show are going to be like, oh my God, like, I don't know what to do with this. But the way that you, obviously, the premise of the podcast of deconstructing a song and then listening to it at the end, it probably also is like, oh, it got some people in or willing to listen to something that screamed at them. And I'm sure that's kind of like you feel a small victory on your end where it's like, well, yeah, I can kind of usher people into this like weird world that I've been a part of in some capacity. I'm sure it's validating.
Well, that was exactly what my expectation was of what was going to happen.
Sure. You're like, how many people is this going to bum out?
Right. Just yeah, I was like, whatever. In this context, even people who aren't into hardcore are going to appreciate this and stuff. And I was actually really surprised to find out that there's a huge... It makes sense now that I think about it.
Right.
That the people who are listening to podcasts in general and listening to Song Exploder is like, it's a lot of people who come from the same culture that I do. So I actually got a huge reaction, probably the biggest reaction I've gotten from any episode.
Yeah.
Was from the Converge episode. All these people who were, on Twitter were like, oh, this is... this new podcast that I started listening to did an episode with my favorite band. I saw that tweet like 20, 30 times. And I was like, oh, wait, that's not what I was expecting.
Right.
But then I realized, I was like, oh, but just like what you're saying, the idea of like any podcast is sort of rooted in independent media.
Totally.
And so it makes sense that people who are into that and who are in their 30s or whatever, in their 20s,
right.
like that 20 years ago they were listening to Converge.
Totally. Yeah. And they were going to house shows, basement shows, local venues. Like I feel, again, like going back to the, I feel so, lucky to have like tripped into this stuff, because it's like the people that I find myself like either gravitating to or getting along with on a deeper level are the people where it's just like, you have that short, like I can walk into your house right now and we immediately have like 30 million things to speak of. And it's just that shorthand. And it's not to say that you wouldn't invite somebody else over to your house, but it'd be that like, we got to warm up to each other. We got to like, oh, so that's the thread I can pull on.
Right.
Like, you like that book or whatever, where we can just be like, here's this tapestry of things, these similar experiences.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's great to see that, like you're saying, it propagates itself in so many different fashions to whatever art a person is creating is inherently rooted to the fact that they're going to, shows and playing in terrible bands and they're that.
Yeah.
age.
They're seeking out something beyond traditional media.
Yeah.
And so once that actually happened, I had a revelation of, oh, right, of course. I should have realized that
right.
would have happened, but I didn't. I had the opposite expectation.
Yeah, I know.
Pleasantly surprised.
It's great that you're pleasantly surprised. Yeah. Another thing that, I mean, I know that you obviously, where you were talking to me earlier, how, you're either scoring a lot of movies, you're doing a lot of, soundtrack type stuff. That is like the number, like if you were to put a list together of people who are, playing in like punk or hardcore bands and are like, reaching that age where they're just like, shit, like I gotta figure something out. Like I gotta like, either I don't have a transition plan to like exist in real life, but like they're really good at music. And so that's like probably number one, number two in most people's lists. Like I'm sure you've experienced that where people just like, hey, how do you do that? I'm sure everybody asks you that. Was it one of those things that you, by happenstance, you started to kind of do that because of the music you were creating with 1AM radio? Or was it a concerted effort where you were like, oh, because I'm creating this music, I think it's well suited to this format?
Actually, me wanting to score films, that was an idea that predated the 1AM radio.
Okay.
It was the reason why I moved to Los Angeles in the first place. And I was like, well, I need to move to Los Angeles, and I can do the 1AM radio from anywhere, so I might as well, because this is where I need to be in order to score films. But before I'd ever put out anything as the 1AM radio, by that point, somewhere around the middle of college, I realized that was what I wanted to do.
Okay.
And it's taken me a little while to get to that point, but I came out here and I was an assistant to a composer for a little while, and I worked on a few films,
right?
Scored some short films, and it just took me that long to get a feature.
Sure. Which, I mean, again, it's the same way that a band exists.
Yeah. You're
going to have to play these more like the fun, but probably terrible shows in order to get up to like, oh wow, like I can actually play out of state or whatever. It's like, I mean, for anyone that like has the notion of like, oh, it's like not an overnight success, but it's like you see the successes that people have and you're just like, I wonder what hard work's gone into that. That's what people should ask, as opposed to like, why don't I have that? It's like, well, you probably got 10 years to like work to that spot. And I mean, since 1AM, like you were saying earlier, like 1AM radio was a focal point of kind of what you were doing for a few years there, to where, did you have to make that tough decision where it's like, I have to scale back 1AM radio because of all these real life limitations, and like I'm not able to tour 200 some odd days? Because at one point you were doing that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would, and I would be doing it now if I had a new record. I just, I never made a conscious decision to scale back. It's just that after the last, after the last record came out a couple years ago,
right,
I was also scoring my first film at the same time, and when we were done with the tour, I was just like, I don't want to play. I was like done with that set.
Sure.
And I just wanted to wait to do another record before I
got
started.
out there.
Yeah.
Sure.
Built a whole thing together.
Right.
Every time a new record comes out, sort of like I have to rebuild the band or just like re-envision the whole project a little bit.
Of course.
So with every record, like...
Well, it's all you.
Yeah. There's different people who have toured with me every single year. Like
right.
year to year, things change. And so I wanted to sort of just take a second and figure out what I was going to do with the next record. And then after that film came out, I got another film. Mm-hmm. And I started working on that. And I'm not very good at multitasking when it comes to music. Like, I can do other things. I can do some artwork and I can do other things,
other
like
mediums,
podcasts.
sure,
yeah,
right.
But I can't. It's harder for me to, be in. I couldn't write songs probably for multiple bands at the same time, or the way that some people can.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to
compartmentalize.
Yeah, like, how people will have different personas.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll put out records under different names. Like Nick Cave has Grinderman over here,
right.
and then Nick Cave over here, and I could never figure out how to do that.
You're only one ham radio.
Yeah. And so when I was in a film scoring mode, I just was putting everything into that, and then and I just haven't written a record's worth of songs yet.
Yeah.
So
do you? The process of obviously, like, just because the one ham radio is a moniker, which is obviously you. Did you feel? Well, first of all, did you like touring? Because I'm sure in certain aspects, because did you ever tour just like solely by yourself, or did you always? Okay.
I did, yeah.
And was that pleasant, or was touring with a band more pleasant, or touring in general? Because that's not for everybody.
Yeah,
especially
I love it.
Okay.
I love all of it.
Okay.
I think I don't love being. I don't know.
I know too. It's a hard thing to explain because you don't want to sound. I know everybody always, like, if there's ever any complaints about touring, people always don't want to sound like, oh, touring sucks, it's so hard, and it's like, well, like, Soda's working at a day job from 9 to 5 or whatever. So it's like, yeah, you don't want to be like, you don't want to feel ungrateful to that fact, but it's like, the reality is that it's like, touring is 90% of it is boredom. 10% is awesome.
Exactly. And I think I get something out of just touring by myself. Mm-hmm. And I've enjoyed that. But I like being able to have a conversation. I like having people around.
Right.
So I prefer touring with other people.
Right.
If I had to only pick one,
sure,
I would probably pick that.
Right.
But I like being able to do both. I think, driving by yourself is great when you know that there's a show at the end of it. It would be really nice, drive for like 10 hours, get to the show, and then get to hang out with people, and then
right.
The next day.
You're like, I'm ready to talk.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going stir crazy. I drove now. I'm excited to see all these people, and yeah, I can see where that, as opposed to sometimes where it's like you're touring with a band, and then you get to the venue and you're just spent. You just like talk to these people, or it's just like there's a weird malaise in the van. And you're just like, oh god, I just gotta get away from these people. You're like, well, I can't get away from myself, so
right.
I can't wait to hang out with all of you. And so once I discovered Song Exploder, and then hearing, like, knowing your musical output and like hearing the format of the podcast, it was like, oh yeah, it's like 100% makes sense. Like, it was one of those like things where it's just like, not only does it speak to like the personality that you've exhibited through your music, but just the intricacies, now knowing what I know more about you now, of songcraft and structure. Because like I joked to you over email, like I sang for all the bands I played in. I have no musical talent from like a songwriting perspective. So I heard the notion of it, and I'm just like, oh, that'll be terrible. Like, I won't be. It'll be terrible for me. I don't think I'll be that interested in it. But the way that you've built it to where it's like, it's obviously a testament to what the format is, So when did the idea exist in your head for a long time to do this, and it took you a while to kind of muster up the courage to put something like this together?
Yeah, it was an idea I've had for a long time as, something that somebody else should do.
Right.
It's like, that would be cool if somebody did that.
I can't wait to listen to that thing.
Yeah.
That's great.
And then last year I was at South by Southwest with one of the films that I scored.
Okay.
And I'd never been to South by Southwest for the film and technology part. I'd
Oh,
only
yeah.
been there for music.
Right.
And that half is totally different. The vibe is totally different.
Really?
And the
Yeah, I've
people
never-
who are there are completely different.
Interesting.
It's a lot less sort of like drunken
Party, yeah.
party bro
Right.
vibe. Not bro exactly, but like hipster party bro.
Completely, yeah.
And it's just sort of a little quieter and nerdier. And,
Right.
There were all these people who were showcasing apps, I think in a completely unofficial way. Like they'd just be hanging out, trying to get people to like sign up for something or giving them postcards. And I got a couple of the things, and they were like really well produced, nicely designed little promo materials, and something about that idea of these guys doing it themselves.
Okay.
I don't know. It felt, I was like, there's a DIY version of like technology or like
Totally.
a different kind of approach. And I have known that, of course, but for some reason it struck me on that trip. And so coming back from that, I decided I will just try and
roll up the
to
sleeves.
actually be like, okay, I'm going to try and see what this could be.
Sure.
And yeah, I was just excited to try and figure it out.
Right.
So that was in March of last year.
Okay.
And then it took me a while to actually make it a real thing.
Sure.
As much as that sort of DIY spirit was inspiring, I also was afraid of making something that would just languish in the ether. That it would feel like public access.
Of course. I'm just putting something out there. No one's really listening. I mean, I see numbers. I see people are downloading it, but that doesn't necessarily give you any feedback.
Right.
Yeah.
So I thought it would be nice to try and find a home for it. And one of my favorite podcasts is The Memory Palace.
Sure.
And it's the only one that I sort of followed really
Regularly.
avidly.
Sure.
And at some point, he announced that he was now going to be a part of the Maximum Fun Network. And I didn't know what that was.
Right.
But so then when I was making Song Exploder
Right.
at first, and thinking about where it could be, Memory Palace was like, well, it's good enough for that guy then.
Right.
I should
Yeah.
check it out.
Yeah.
And so I sent a demo. I made a demo and I sent it to them.
That's awesome.
And
I never even thought about the context of that. Like, yeah, like it makes sense for a prominent person in whatever industry. Like you have to make a demo. Like, that's cool. I mean, yeah, it's exactly the same thing as giving a crappy demo tape to the band you played with that night. Be like, oh, dude, here you go.
Yeah.
Like, maybe we'll play some shows together.
it's exact. I mean, I wrote a letter and sent a CD with like a download link because who listens to CDs anymore?
Right.
But I sent it just in case.
Yeah.
And I sent it to Jesse Thorne.
Sure.
And he had I think he had Ted Leo on his show
Yeah,
at
he
one
did.
point. And so I sent him a copy of my split with Ted Leo and the note and the demo. And I
Right.
was like,
You're like, I'm establishing credibility.
Right.
I'm not just because I totally get that because I feel like they're, especially when you've kind of done a lot of stuff, but obviously it's like never risen to like the mainstream level where it's like, you should know me. Like, you should know me.
Right,
like,
right.
And plus, if you're presuming that, you're an asshole anyways. But you feel like you have to quantify yourself in some capacities where you're just like, dude, I'm not like, this is a deliberate thing. I'm not some schmo. Like,
yeah. And I had no idea what the kind of volume of demos they get or, people trying to do that. So yeah, it was for some context.
Yeah.
And I sent that in like September or something and then didn't hear from him and didn't know exactly what the protocol was for following
how
up.
long do I wait?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have a friend here who's an actor. His name's Josh Molina, who was on like The West Wing and
Sure.
stuff. And he had been on Bullseye. He'd been on Jesse's show. And so I asked him, I was like, do you know this guy? Do you have his
it
email
work?
address?
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, sure, yeah. He's like, oh, he's a nice guy. Let me try and find his email. And then he just couldn't find it. And then in December, this past December, he was like, I found his email, and I talked to him, and he's going to get in touch with you.
Perfect.
And so I got so then we were in email contact, and I remember he was like, okay, let's talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
And he said something about like, he's like, I think it's a cool idea, you know, and if you want to have a conversation, I can give you some feedback.
Sure.
I was like, okay, so it sounds like it's not for him, but
yeah,
but I could get some advice, and certainly I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So
sure, you're like, this is perfect.
Yeah. I'll take any advice I can get.
Right.
So we spoke the next day on the phone, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, I realized that he was saying that he would pick the show up, and he was like, and so he's like, yeah, so we're announcing 5 new shows on January 1st, and we'd love to include this as one of the shows. And I was like, it's December 17th, and I was going on a trip with my family on Christmas Day for 2 weeks.
Sure.
We were going to India.
Okay.
So I was like, so I had 8 days to get it ready, and there were things that, you know, that he had suggested that were good ideas,
Right.
like changing the name.
Okay.
Because the original name was Deconstructed.
Okay.
And he said, he was like, it's a great name, it works, but it's really important for people to have a name that for people who don't know what the show is, for them to understand what it might be.
Sure.
Whereas, you know, Deconstructed might be cool, but a little bit more oblique.
Sure.
I was like, oh, okay, that's a good idea. And also the original demo, you know, I'm not in the podcast that much.
Right.
Originally, I wasn't in it at all.
Oh, okay.
So the first episode, the Postal Service episode, I originally it was just Jimmy Tamborello doing the intro by himself.
Got it.
And that was my plan, is that every artist would introduce their own
Sure.
song and their own episode, and I just wouldn't be in it at all.
Yeah. I'm producing this. I'm not a host. Right.
Yeah,
Sure.
There is no host. It's just,
right.
And I thought that would be kind of a unique take on it,
Mm-hmm.
and I liked that, and wasn't really interested in
Right.
having my personality be a part of it.
Sure.
But he said that he thought it was important. He's like, it's nice for listeners to feel like there's an author
Mm-hmm.
behind things. I thought that was smart advice. So then I had to come up with a new name, figure out the format,
Shove this all in, yeah.
and get it up, make a website, publish it to, you know,
Sure.
figure out the
Here's the artwork.
yeah,
Here's everything.
all that stuff. And luckily, I had Jesse and all the people at Maximum Fun to help me figure that stuff out. But I only had a week to do it.
Right.
So that got a little bit crazy.
Like what? Definitely down to crunch time where it's just like, so this is okay, cool. Yeah, I'll get that done.
Yeah.
Oh shit. Where does it go from here? The last thing I want to hit on before I left you was one kind of going back to the point, like I think what is something I've realized in regards to like the DIY nature of a lot of different things, like you were saying, technology, how that kind of opened your eyes. I think what inherently makes the DIY whatever punk hardcore / independent community from the musical perspective special is because like even though now there is a notion that bands of that nature can exist off of their music, there obviously at many points there's never been a note like you weren't playing in bands because you're like, oh dude, like this is it, like and it's like, I mean, same as me and same as a million of other mutual friends, like that was never the notion. I mean, Converge, they never thought they would be a band 20 some odd years later. So because there's no sort of monetary attachment, it's just well, this is exciting. It could afford us opportunities, but that's it. Whereas technology companies, it's like, cool, in 6 months I'm going to get Yahoo to buy this out, right? Like, and so I think that's kind of like, what I've noticed, where it's like, it kind of make it, this community that we're a part of, it kind of stays in its own lane from that perspective, because it does its best to not be corrupted from the monetary gains.
Yeah, for better or for worse. I mean,
true.
There was a time when I had an offer from Apple to work there.
Sure.
And I worked there for 3 months doing design.
Okay.
They needed some help, and they were looking to hire new people.
Right.
And I was like, I'm not really looking for I want to live in LA. I want to do music. I want to do film music. I'm not trying to do design as my full-time job. I don't really want to have a full-time job. I just want to make music as much as possible and then work as whatever I have to pay the rent.
Sure.
Thought it would be a good idea to just try it, make a little bit of money and then have something to live off of. And so I worked, I they offered me like a 6-month contract, and I was like, how about 3 months? And they're like, okay. And so I went there and worked for 3 months, and then at the end of it, I was like, I got to go on tour. And I think about that decision a lot because that was a lot of money that I made for like a brief amount of time. And even if I had gotten on for 6 months, I mean, it just would have been, my life would be completely different. You know, living in San Francisco and like making that kind of money was insane.
Yeah.
And that was a long time ago now.
Yeah. But it took you, I mean, but
it was a conscious decision to be like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want this stuff.
I don't want this, because ultimately I think what I've noticed that, you know, sort of pulls people away from their passions is, I mean, obviously financial concerns and reasons, like that's, you know, number one, but like as you were alluding to earlier, like time is clearly a resource. So it's like the time and the energy. So it's like, you know, a person after a day of work, it's like, you know, they have from like 5 at night until, you know, 10 at night until they're exhausted. But it's like, want to build your life as such to where whatever it is you're doing to put the, you know, the food on the table, so to speak, won't inhibit that, like that. You'll still have that energy, even if you are doing something that you don't particularly care about, that it still will afford you that opportunity to be creative in whatever capacity you want.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people lose it, where they're just like, oh, after like 6 months, they're just like, I'm tired. Like, everybody gets lazy, and that's understandable.
Yeah.
But for you, like you were saying, to make that conscious decision, like, I like it, where it's like, yeah, I got to go on tour. Like, yeah, I like how you negotiated from 6 months to 3 months. You were just like, no, yeah,
three dumb.
You're like 3 months. Like, who does a 3-month contract? Like,
no, I could have lived off that money for like a year and a half.
That's crazy.
I mean, because at the time where I was living in LA, I was literally living in my friend's closet for $200 a month.
Right.
So I mean, I could have stretched that out for such a long time.
Right. You're like, oh, 20 grand? Like, dude, that's 2 years right there. You're like, as long as I don't spend any money on anything else, this is perfect.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you hanging out, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no, you invited me.
So there you go. That was Hrishikesh, and I can't thank him enough for doing that. And like I said, check out his podcast, Song Exploder. You can find it on iTunes or MaximumFun.org. Great show. Just love it. And visit 100wordspodcast.com. Our producer, as always, is Tom Richfield. Endless amounts of love poured out to that young chap, because he's a chap. He's from the UK. Thank you very much for listening, and until next week, be safe, everybody.